The train whistle pierced the morning air as it pulled into Cedar Creek Station, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of passengers seeking new beginnings in the American West. Among them sat Alina Whitmore, her gloved hands clutched tightly around a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world. At 23, she had already endured more heartbreak than most women twice her age, and now she was traveling to a place she had never seen to marry a man she had never met. Alina's reflection in the train window revealed a woman of modest beauty. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes held a mixture of determination and fear. She wore her best dress, a navy blue wool that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. The letter in her satchel, worn from countless readings, contained the correspondence that had brought her here. James Mitchell, a rancher in Cedar Creek, had advertised for a wife through the matrimonial newspapers back east. His letters had been kind, if brief, describing a man in his 30s who owned a small cattle ranch and sought a woman of good character to share his life. The journey from Boston had taken Alina through cities and countryside she had only read about in books. Each mile that passed beneath the train's wheels took her further from the life she had known and closer to an uncertain future. She thought about her sister Margaret, who had begged her not to go, and her mother, who had passed away the previous winter, leaving Alina with no family except Margaret and her disapproving husband. Alina had worked as a seamstress in a factory before deciding to answer James Mitchell's advertisement. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to survive. When Margaret married Thomas Brennan, a banker with strict ideas about propriety, Alina found herself unwelcome in their household. Thomas made it clear that having an unmarried sister-in-law living under his roof was improper, and Margaret, torn between loyalty to her sister and duty to her husband, could offer little support. The idea of becoming a mail-order bride had come to Alina through another factory worker, Mary O'Connell, who had successfully married a shopkeeper in Kansas through correspondence. Mary's letters spoke of a good man who treated her well and a life far better than what she had left behind in the crowded tenements of Boston. Alina had hesitated for months before finally writing her first letter to James Mitchell, but desperation and hope had eventually overcome her fear. Their correspondence had lasted 6 months. James wrote about his ranch, his cattle, and his dreams of building something lasting in the frontier territory. He seemed educated and thoughtful, though his letters revealed little about his personal feelings or character beyond his stated desire for a wife who could help him build a home and family. Alina had been honest about her circumstances, her work as a seamstress, and her lack of a substantial dowry. James had seemed satisfied with her responses and had eventually proposed marriage through the mail, sending money for her train ticket and promising to meet her at the Cedar Creek Station. As the train began to slow, Alina could see the small buildings of Cedar Creek coming into view. The town was smaller than she had expected, with a main street lined with wooden storefronts and houses scattered along unpaved roads. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still covered with snow despite the warmth of early summer. Everything looked new and rough compared to the established neighborhoods of Boston, but there was something appealing about the wide open spaces and clean air. Alina gathered her belongings as the train came to a complete stop. She had only one trunk and her satchel, containing her few dresses, some personal items, and the small savings she had managed to accumulate. Other passengers began to disembark, and Alina found herself swept along with the crowd onto the wooden platform of Cedar Creek Station. The platform buzzed with activity as people greeted arriving passengers and loaded cargo from the train. Alina stood uncertainly, looking around for a man who might be James Mitchell. She had sent him a photograph, and he had described himself as tall with dark hair and a beard, but several men on the platform matched that description. After several minutes of waiting, Alina approached the station master, a kindly-looking man with gray whiskers. "Excuse me, sir, I'm looking for James Mitchell. He was supposed to meet me here." The station master's expression grew uncomfortable. "Miss Whitmore, I presume?" When Alina nodded, he continued, "I'm afraid Mr. Mitchell left a message for you. He asked me to tell you that he has reconsidered his proposal and will not be able to marry you as planned." Alina felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Reconsidered? But we have been corresponding for months. He sent me money for the train ticket." "I'm sorry, miss. He didn't provide any explanation beyond that. He did leave this envelope for you." The station master handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in James Mitchell's familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, Alina opened the letter. The message was brief and devastating. Miss Whitmore, I regret to inform you that circumstances have changed, and I am no longer able to proceed with our marriage plans. I have arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house for 1 week, after which you will need to make your own arrangements. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. James Mitchell. Alina read the letter twice, unable to believe what she was seeing. There was no explanation, no apology that seemed adequate for the situation, and no indication of what circumstances had changed. She was stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money to survive for more than a few days. The station master watched her with sympathy. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house is just down Main Street. She's expecting you. Alina nodded numbly and picked up her trunk. The walk to the boarding house felt like the longest of her life. People on the street stared at her with curiosity, and she could hear whispered conversations that she was sure concerned her situation. In a town the size of Cedar Creek, news traveled fast, and everyone would soon know about the mail-order bride who had been rejected before she even met her intended husband. Mrs. Patterson was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a kind but no-nonsense demeanor. She showed Alina to a small room on the second floor of her boarding house and explained the rules about meals and visitors. Alina unpacked her few belongings and sat on the narrow bed, trying to process what had happened. The room was clean but sparse, with a single window that looked out onto Main Street. Alina could see people going about their daily business, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, children playing in the dust, and cowboys riding through town. It was a different world from Boston, but she had been prepared for that. What she had not been prepared for was being abandoned before her new life could even begin. That evening, Alina made her way downstairs for supper served family-style in Mrs. Patterson's dining room. The other boarders included a traveling salesman, an elderly man who worked at the general store, and a woman named Sarah who taught at the local school. The conversation was polite but strained, and Alina could feel their curious glances throughout the meal. After supper, Alina returned to her room and wrote a letter to Margaret, though she was not sure when she would be able to afford postage to send it. She explained her situation and asked for advice, though she knew Margaret would have little to offer beyond an invitation to return to Boston, which Thomas would never allow. The next morning, Alina decided to explore Cedar Creek and perhaps find some way to support herself. The town was indeed small, with a main street that contained a general store, a bank, a saloon, a church, and a few other businesses. There was a dress shop run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, and Alina wondered if her skills as a seamstress might be useful there. When Alina introduced herself to Mrs. Harper and explained her situation, the older woman's expression grew sympathetic but cautious. I heard about what happened with James Mitchell. Terrible business, leaving you stranded like that. As for work, I do most of my sewing myself, but I might be able to use some help with alterations during busy times. The work would be sporadic and poorly paid, but it was something. Alina also inquired at the general store, the hotel, and even the saloon, but found few opportunities for respectable employment for a woman alone. Cedar Creek was not a large town, and most families provided for their own needs rather than hearing outside help. On her third day in town, Alina was walking past the church when she encountered a group of women leaving after what appeared to be a ladies' auxiliary meeting. One of them, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, approached Alina with a cold expression. "You must be the mail-order bride," the woman said without introduction. "I'm Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell, James's sister-in-law." Alina felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm Alina Whitmore. I'm sorry about the circumstances." "As you should be," Mrs. Mitchell replied sharply. "James is a respected man in this community, and your arrival has caused quite a stir. I hope you don't plan to make trouble for him." "I have no intention of making trouble for anyone," Alina said quietly. "I'm simply trying to find a way to support myself." "Well, you won't find it by chasing after James. He made his decision, and you should respect it." Mrs. Mitchell's voice carried clearly, and Alina was aware that other women were listening to their conversation. Alina excused herself and hurried back to the boarding house, her face hot with shame and anger. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated as if she were some sort of adventuress seeking to trap an unwilling man. The injustice of the situation made her want to cry, but she forced herself to remain composed. That afternoon, as Alina sat on the front porch of the boarding house trying to decide what to do next, she noticed a commotion down the street. A horse and rider were approaching at a fast pace, and people were gathering to watch. The rider was a man in his late 20s with sun-bleached brown hair and clothes that marked him as a working cowboy. He brought his horse to a stop in front of the general store and dismounted with easy grace. Alina found herself watching him with interest. There was something about his confident manner and the way he carried himself that commanded attention. She could hear fragments of conversation as people approached him, and it seemed he was well-known and well-liked in the community. As Alina watched, the cowboy happened to glance in her direction. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, Alina felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, as if she were seeing someone she had been waiting for without knowing it. The cowboy tipped his hat in her direction with a slight smile before turning back to his business. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside Alina on the porch. "That's Luke Cameron," she said, following Alina's gaze. "He works the Double Bar Ranch outside of town. Good man, though he keeps to himself mostly." Alina nodded, storing the information away. She found herself wondering about Luke Cameron and what his story might be, but she quickly dismissed such thoughts. She was in no position to be interested in any man, especially when her own situation was so precarious. The rest of the week passed slowly. Alina helped Mrs. Harper with some sewing projects, earning a few dollars that would help extend her stay at the boarding house by another few days. She also spent time exploring the area around Cedar Creek, walking along the creek that gave the town its name, and enjoying the mountain scenery that was so different from the urban landscape she had known in Boston. On Saturday evening, there was a social gathering at the town hall, and Mrs. Patterson encouraged Alina to attend. "It will do you good to meet some people," the older woman said kindly. "Not everyone in town is as judgmental as Dorothy Mitchell." Alina was hesitant, knowing that her situation would make her the subject of gossip and speculation, but she finally decided that hiding in her room would not improve her circumstances. She wore her best dress and made her way to the town hall as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The hall was decorated with bunting and lanterns, and a small band was playing music for dancing. Tables along the walls held refreshments prepared by the women of the town, and groups of people stood talking and laughing. Alina felt conspicuous as she entered, aware that conversations paused as people noticed her arrival. Sarah, the schoolteacher from the boarding house, approached Alina with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you decided to come. Let me introduce you to some people." Sarah led Alina around the room, making introductions to several families and single women. Most people were polite, though Alina could sense their curiosity about her situation. A few were genuinely friendly, particularly the younger unmarried women who seemed to view Alina as an interesting addition to their small social circle. As the evening progressed, Alina began to relax and even enjoy herself. The music was lively, and she accepted several invitations to dance from young men who seemed more interested in her as a novelty than as a serious romantic prospect. She was grateful for their attention, though, as it helped her feel less like an object of pity. During a break in the dancing, Alina stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was clear and cool, with stars visible in abundance overhead. She was standing on the steps of the town hall when she heard a voice behind her. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Alina turned to find Luke Cameron standing a few feet away. He had cleaned up for the social, wearing a white shirt and dark vest instead of his work clothes, but he still carried himself with the same quiet confidence she had noticed before. "Yes, it is," Alina replied. "The sky seems so much bigger here than it did back east." "You're from back east, then?" Luke asked, moving to stand beside her on the steps. "Boston," Alina said. "I arrived on Monday's train." She hesitated, then added, "I suppose you've heard about my circumstances." Luke nodded. "Word travels fast in a town this size. I'm sorry about how things worked out with Mitchell." Alina appreciated that he didn't try to offer false comfort or platitudes. "I'm trying to figure out what to do next," she said honestly. "What kind of work did you do in Boston?" "I was a seamstress in a factory. Mrs. Harper has given me some alteration work, but it's not enough to live on." Luke was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains. "There might be other opportunities," he said finally. "The Double Bar is a big spread, and sometimes we need help with domestic work, especially during roundup and branding season." Alina looked at him with interest. "What kind of help?" "Cooking for the hands, mending clothes, that sort of thing. It's hard work and the conditions are rough, but it pays fair wages." Before Alina could respond, the sound of voices from inside the hall grew louder, and they could hear someone calling for the next dance to begin. Luke turned to Alina with a slight smile. "Would you care to dance, Miss Whitmore?" Alina hesitated. She was aware that dancing with Luke would likely generate gossip, and she was already the subject of enough speculation. But there was something about his straightforward manner and the genuine kindness in his eyes that made her want to accept. "I'd like that," she said. Luke offered his arm, and they walked back into the hall together. The band was beginning a waltz, and Luke led Alina onto the dance floor with surprising grace. He was a good dancer, leading her smoothly through the steps, and Alina found herself relaxing in his arms. "You dance well for a cowboy," Alina said with a small smile. "My mother insisted on lessons when I was young," Luke replied. "Said a man should know how to conduct himself properly in polite society." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Luke said, his expression growing slightly sad. "She passed away 5 years ago." Alina could hear the affection and loss in his voice. "I'm sorry, I lost my mother last winter." "Then you understand," Luke said simply. As they danced, Alina became aware that they were drawing attention from other couples on the floor and from people standing around the edges of the room. She could see Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell watching them with obvious disapproval, and several other women were whispering behind their fans. "People are staring," Alina murmured. "Let them stare," Luke replied calmly. "You have as much right to be here as anyone else." When the dance ended, Luke escorted Alina back to where Sarah was standing with a group of young women. He tipped his hat politely to the group and thanked Alina for the dance before moving away to talk with some of the other men. "My goodness," Sarah whispered to Alina. "Luke Cameron hardly ever dances with anyone. You must have made quite an impression." Alina watched Luke across the room, noting how the other men seemed to respect and like him. He had an easy way of talking with people, and she could see why Mrs. Patterson had called him a good man. There was something solid and dependable about him that appealed to her, especially after her experience with James Mitchell's abandonment. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, though Alina declined several other invitations to dance, feeling that she had already provided enough material for the town's gossips. When the social began to wind down, Luke appeared at her side again. "I'd be happy to walk you back to the boarding house," he offered. Alina accepted, and they made their way through the quiet streets of Cedar Creek. The night air was crisp, and Alina pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Luke walked beside her with easy strides, his presence somehow comforting in the darkness. "Thank you for the dance," Alina said as they approached the boarding house, "and for treating me kindly when others haven't." "You don't need to thank me for basic decency," Luke replied. "What happened to you wasn't right, and anyone with sense can see that." Alina felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been a long time since anyone had defended her so simply and directly. "You mentioned work at the double bar," Alina said tentatively. "Were you serious about that?" Luke stopped walking and turned to face her. "I was. The boss, Mr. Henderson, is a fair man and his wife runs the household. They might be willing to give you a chance, especially if you're willing to work hard." "I am," Alina said quickly. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "I could speak to them if you'd like. No promises, but it might be worth asking." Alina felt a flutter of hope in her chest. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it might buy her time to figure out her next steps. "I would be grateful if you would." Luke nodded. "I'll ride out there tomorrow and talk to them. I'll let you know what they say." They had reached the front steps of the boarding house, and Alina turned to face Luke. In the light from the porch lamp, she could see his face clearly, noting the strong jaw, the kind eyes, and the way he looked at her with respect rather than pity. "Thank you, Mr. Cameron. You've been very kind to a stranger." "Luke," he said, "and you're not really a stranger anymore, are you, Alina?" The way he said her name, with a slight smile and genuine warmth, made Alina's heart skip a beat. She realized that for the first time since arriving in Cedar Creek, she felt something other than despair and uncertainty. This man, with his quiet strength and honest manner, was offering her hope and treating her like a person worthy of respect. "No," Alina said softly, "I suppose I'm not." Luke tipped his hat to her. "Good night, Alina. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon to let you know what Mr. Henderson says." Alina watched him walk away into the darkness, his figure gradually disappearing down Main Street. She stood on the porch for several minutes after he was gone, thinking about the unexpected turn her evening had taken. When she had dressed for the social, she had hoped only to make a few acquaintances and perhaps improve her standing in the community slightly. She had not expected to meet someone like Luke Cameron, who seemed to see past her circumstances to the person she was underneath. As Alina made her way upstairs to her room, she allowed herself to feel a cautious optimism about the future for the first time since arriving in Cedar Creek. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she now had at least one person in this strange new place who seemed willing to help her find her way. Alina woke the next morning with a sense of anticipation that she had not felt since leaving Boston. Sunlight streamed through her window, and she could hear the sounds of Cedar Creek coming to life below. For the first time in a week, she had slept soundly, untroubled by the constant worry about her future that had plagued her nights since James Mitchell's rejection. After breakfast with the other boarders, Alina spent the morning helping Mrs. Harper with alterations. The older woman had several dresses that needed hemming and a man's coat that required new buttons, work that Alina completed quickly and skillfully. Mrs. Harper paid her 50 cents for the morning's work, money that Alina carefully tucked away in her small savings. "You do fine work," Mrs. Harper observed as Alina finished pressing a seam. "Better than most I've seen. Where did you learn to sew like that?" "My mother taught me when I was young, and then I worked in a factory in Boston for 3 years," Alina explained. "The factory work was mostly simple pieces, but my mother made sure I learned proper techniques for all kinds of garments." Mrs. Harper nodded approvingly. "Good training shows. I wish I had more work to give you, but in a town this size, there's only so much call for a seamstress." Alina understood. Cedar Creek was not Boston, where fashion and frequent changes of clothing were important to many women. Here, people made their clothes last, mending and altering as necessary rather than buying new. It was a practical approach that left little room for professional seamstresses. After finishing her work at the dress shop, Alina returned to the boarding house for lunch. She was surprised to find Luke Cameron sitting on the front porch with Mrs. Patterson, his hat in his hands and his horse tied to the hitching post in front of the house. He stood when he saw Alina approaching. "Miss Whitmore," he said formally, though his eyes held the same warmth she remembered from the night before. "I spoke with Mr. and Mrs. Henderson this morning about the position we discussed." Alina felt her heart leap with hope and fear. "What did they say?" "They'd like to meet with you," Luke said. "Mrs. Henderson has been managing the household work herself, but with roundup season coming and extra hands to feed, she could use help. If you're interested, I can take you out to the ranch this afternoon." "Oh yes," Alina said quickly. "I'm very interested." Mrs. Patterson smiled at Alina. "I told Mr. Cameron you were a hard worker and a respectable young lady. I hope it works out for you, dear." Luke looked at Alina seriously. "I should warn you, it's not easy work. Mrs. Henderson runs a tight household, and the men expect their meals on time and their clothes clean. The ranch is also 10 miles out of town, so if you take the position, you'd be living there during the week." Alina nodded. She had expected that any ranch work would be demanding and isolated. "I'm prepared for hard work, and I don't mind being away from town." "Good," Luke said. "We can ride out now if you're ready. Do you have riding clothes?" Alina shook her head. Her wardrobe consisted of dresses suitable for town life, not for riding horses. Luke considered this for a moment. "Mrs. Henderson is about your size. I'm sure she can lend you something appropriate until you can get your own riding outfit." Alina went upstairs to collect her shawl and reticule, her mind racing with possibilities. This could be the solution she desperately needed, a way to support herself with honest work while she figured out her longer-term plans. She had no illusions about ranch life being easy, but she was willing to try anything that would give her independence and purpose. When Alina came back downstairs, Luke was waiting beside his horse and a second horse that he had apparently brought for her use. The mare was a gentle-looking bay with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. "This is Buttercup," Luke said as he helped Alina mount. "She's the most reliable horse we have. Mrs. Henderson learned to ride on her." Alina settled herself in the side saddle with Luke's assistance, grateful for the riding lessons she had taken as a child when her family had been more prosperous. It had been years since she had ridden, but the basic skills came back to her as they set out from town. The ride to the Double Bar Ranch took them through beautiful countryside, with rolling hills covered in grass and wildflowers. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still snow-capped despite the warming weather. Eleanor found herself marveling at the vastness of the landscape, so different from the crowded streets and buildings of Boston. Luke rode beside her, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography of the area. "The ranch covers about 10,000 acres," he said. "Mr. Henderson bought the land 15 years ago when he first came west. He's built it up from nothing into one of the most successful operations in the territory." "How long have you worked for him?" Eleanor asked. 5 years, Luke replied. "I came here after my mother died. Mr. Henderson gave me a chance when I needed work, and I've stayed because he's a good man to work for." Eleanor could hear the respect and loyalty in Luke's voice when he spoke of his employer. "What happened to your father?" Luke's expression grew distant. "He died in the war when I was 12. My mother and I managed the family farm in Kansas until she got sick. After she passed, I sold the place and came west looking for a new start." Eleanor understood the pain of losing parents and facing an uncertain future alone. It must have been difficult, leaving everything behind. "It was," Luke agreed, "but sometimes a fresh start is exactly what a person needs." Eleanor wondered if he was speaking as much about her situation as his own. There was something comforting about knowing that Luke had also faced loss and uncertainty, that he understood what it meant to rebuild a life from nothing. As they crested a hill, Eleanor got her first view of the Double Bar Ranch. The main house was a large, 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wraparound porch and several outbuildings scattered around it. She could see a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and various other structures that spoke of a well-organized and prosperous operation. "It's impressive," Eleanor said, and she meant it. The ranch had a sense of permanence and success that was reassuring. "Mr. Henderson believes in doing things right," Luke said with pride. "Everything here is built to last." They rode into the yard, where several men were working with horses in one of the corrals. The men stopped their work to watch Eleanor and Luke arrive, and Eleanor could feel their curious gazes. She straightened her shoulders and tried to look confident despite her nervousness. Luke dismounted and came around to help Eleanor down from her horse. "The men are good people," he said quietly. "They might seem a bit rough at first, but they're respectful to the women folk." As they approached the main house, the front door opened, and a woman in her 40s emerged onto the porch. She was tall and sturdy, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes. Her dress was simple but well-made, and she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to managing a large household. "Mrs. Henderson," Luke said, removing his hat. "This is Miss Eleanor Whitmore." Mrs. Henderson looked Eleanor over with a direct gaze that seemed to assess everything about her in a few moments. "Miss Whitmore," she said in a warm but businesslike voice. "Luke tells me you're looking for work." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor replied. "I have experience with cooking, cleaning, and sewing. I'm willing to work hard." "Come inside, then, and we'll talk." Mrs. Henderson led them into the main house, which was spacious and well-furnished without being fancy. The furniture was sturdy and practical, and everything was scrupulously clean. Eleanor could see that Mrs. Henderson ran her household with efficiency and high standards. They settled in the front parlor, where Mrs. Henderson gestured for Eleanor to take a seat on a comfortable sofa while Luke remained standing near the door. "Luke tells me you came west to marry James Mitchell," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she met the older woman's gaze steadily. "That's correct. He changed his mind after I arrived." "His loss," Mrs. Henderson said briskly. "James Mitchell always was a fool. Now tell me about your experience." Eleanor described her work in the factory, her skills with sewing and mending, and her experience helping her mother manage their household before her death. Mrs. Henderson listened intently, asking occasional questions about specific tasks and requirements. "The work here is demanding," Mrs. Henderson explained. "During roundup season, we'll have 20 men to feed 3 times a day, plus all the regular household chores. Laundry for that many men is a constant job, and everything has to be done to high standards. The men work hard, and they expect their comfort to be taken care of properly." "I understand," Eleanor said. "I'm not afraid of hard work or long hours." Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment. "Luke speaks highly of you, and his judgment is usually sound. I'm willing to give you a trial period. Room and board plus $25 a month to start, with a raise to $30 if things work out after 3 months." Alina felt a surge of relief and gratitude. $25 a month was more than she had made at the factory, and with room and board included, she would be able to save money for the first time in her life. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I won't disappoint you." "I hope not," Mrs. Henderson said. "When can you start?" "Immediately, if you need me to." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Good. Luke can take you back to town to collect your things. Plan to return by tomorrow morning. I'll have one of the men drive you in the wagon." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson led Alina through the house, showing her the kitchen, the dining room, and the rooms where she would be working. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a massive iron stove, plenty of workspace, and a pantry stocked with supplies. Alina could see that preparing meals for 20 men would indeed be a substantial task, but the kitchen was designed to handle large-scale cooking. "Your room will be upstairs," Mrs. Henderson said, leading Alina up a staircase to the second floor. "It's small but private, and you'll have your own washstand." The room was indeed small, but it was clean and comfortable, with a single bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. Alina thought it was much nicer than her room at the boarding house, and she would have privacy and space to call her own. As they came back downstairs, Mr. Henderson arrived at the house. He was a man in his 50s with weathered features and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He greeted Luke warmly and was introduced to Alina with courteous formality. "Luke tells me you're going to help Martha with the household," Mr. Henderson said. "We're grateful for the assistance. This place runs better when my wife isn't trying to do everything herself." Alina could see the affection and respect between the married couple, and she felt hopeful about working for people who clearly cared about each other and their employees. The ride back to town gave Alina time to process what had just happened. In the span of a few hours, her entire situation had changed. She would have work, a place to live, and the opportunity to support herself independently. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she arrived in Cedar Creek. "Thank you," she said to Luke as they rode. "I don't know how to express how grateful I am for your help." "No thanks necessary," Luke replied. "Mrs. Henderson needed help and you need work. It's a good arrangement for everyone." Alina sensed there was more to Luke's assistance than simple practicality, but she didn't press the issue. Whatever his motivations, she was grateful for his kindness and support during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Back in town, Alina quickly packed her belongings and said goodbye to Mrs. Patterson, who was genuinely pleased about Alina's good fortune. "I'll miss having you here," the older woman said, "but I'm glad you found something that will suit you better than staying in town." Alina also stopped by Mrs. Harper's dress shop to let her know about the position and to arrange to do alterations work during her time off. Mrs. Harper was pleased to know she would still have access to Alina's skills. "Ranch work will be good for you," Mrs. Harper said. "Mrs. Henderson is a fine woman and the Double Bar is a respectable place. You'll be safe there." That evening, Alina had dinner at the boarding house for the last time. The other boarders congratulated her on finding employment, and even the traveling salesman, who had previously shown little interest in her situation, offered his best wishes for her success. As Alina prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how quickly her circumstances had changed. A week ago, she had been a rejected mail-order bride with no prospects and dwindling resources. Now she had employment that would provide her with independence and the opportunity to build a new life. The work would be challenging, but she was confident in her abilities and determined to succeed. She thought about Luke Cameron and his role in this turn of fortune. He had gone out of his way to help a stranger, treating her with kindness and respect when others in the community had been judgmental or indifferent. She found herself looking forward to seeing him again at the ranch, though she reminded herself that he was simply a fellow employee and that she should not read too much into his helpfulness. The next morning, Alina was ready when one of the ranch hands arrived with a wagon to transport her and her belongings to the Double Bar. The driver was a young man named Tom who was polite, but shy, speaking little during the journey except to point out various landmarks along the way. At the ranch, Mrs. Henderson was waiting to begin Alina's training immediately. The older woman showed Alina the routine for preparing breakfast for the hands, explaining the quantities needed and the preferences of various workers. "Most of the men like their eggs fried hard and their bacon crispy," Mrs. Henderson explained as she demonstrated the morning routine. Coffee needs to be strong enough to float a horseshoe, and biscuits should be light and hot. They'll eat just about anything if it's well prepared and there's plenty of it. Elinor watched carefully, taking mental notes about timing and preparation. Cooking for 20 men was very different from preparing meals for a family, requiring careful planning and organization to have everything ready at the same time. The men eat at 5:30 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening, Mrs. Henderson continued. Breakfast is usually eggs, bacon or ham, biscuits, fried potatoes, and coffee. Dinner at noon is the biggest meal with meat, vegetables, bread, and pie or cake if possible. Supper is lighter but still substantial. Elinor could see that the work would require her to be up before dawn and busy until evening, but she was prepared for the demanding schedule. The kitchen was well organized, and Mrs. Henderson obviously knew how to manage large-scale cooking efficiently. After the breakfast lesson, Mrs. Henderson showed Elinor the laundry facilities, which included large tubs for washing and lines for drying. Laundry is done twice a week, she explained. The men provide their own work clothes, but we wash and mend them as needed. Bedding and household linens are done separately. The washing process was laborious, involving heating large quantities of water, scrubbing clothes by hand, and wringing them out before hanging them to dry. Elinor's hands were already rough from factory work, but she could see that ranch work would test her endurance in new ways. As the morning progressed, Elinor met several of the ranch hands who came to the house on various errands. They were polite but reserved, clearly waiting to see how she would work out before forming opinions about her. She could understand their caution, knowing that their comfort and welfare depended on having competent help in the kitchen. Luke appeared around mid-morning, ostensibly to check on a repair that needed to be made to the kitchen door, but obviously also to see how Elinor was settling in. He spoke briefly with Mrs. Henderson about ranch business, then turned to Elinor. "How are you finding everything?" he asked. "It's a lot to learn, but Mrs. Henderson is an excellent teacher," Elinor replied. "I think I'm going to like it here." Luke smiled, and Elinor noticed that his expression seemed pleased and perhaps a bit relieved. "I'm glad to hear it. If you need anything or have any questions about the ranch, don't hesitate to ask." Mrs. Henderson watched this exchange with interest, and Elinor wondered what the older woman might be thinking about Luke's obvious concern for her welfare. She hoped her new employer wouldn't think there was anything improper about their acquaintance. After Luke left, Mrs. Henderson continued Elinor's training with lessons in managing the household supplies and planning meals around the seasonal availability of ingredients. The ranch maintained a large vegetable garden, kept chickens for eggs, and had access to fresh beef and pork from their own livestock. Other supplies came from town on a weekly basis, requiring careful planning to ensure they never ran short of essential items. "The men work hard and they eat accordingly," Mrs. Henderson explained. "A hungry cowboy is an unhappy cowboy, and an unhappy cowboy doesn't work well. Keeping them well fed is one of the most important jobs on this ranch." Elinor understood the responsibility that came with her position. The success of the ranch depended on many factors, and ensuring that the workers were properly cared for was essential to maintaining the operation's productivity and morale. At noon, Elinor helped prepare her first meal for the ranch hands. Mrs. Henderson supervised closely as Elinor fried steaks, prepared potatoes, and heated vegetables from the previous day's canning. The amount seemed enormous to Elinor, accustomed to cooking for small groups, but Mrs. Henderson assured her that 20 hungry men would consume everything they prepared. When the dinner bell rang, the hands came in from their work, washing at the basins on the back porch before entering the dining room. They were a diverse group, ranging in age from young men barely out of their teens to experienced cowboys in their 50s. Most were polite, thanking Elinor when she served their plates and complimenting the food. Elinor found herself watching for Luke among the men, and she felt a small flutter of pleasure when he appeared with the second group of workers. He caught her eye and nodded approvingly at the meal, a simple gesture that somehow made Elinor feel proud of her work. After the meal, Elinor helped Mrs. Henderson clean up the dining room and kitchen, a process that took nearly an hour. The dishes, pots, and serving platters had to be washed, dried, and put away, and the kitchen had to be cleaned and prepared for the next meal. "You did well for your first day," Mrs. Henderson said as they finished the cleanup. The men seemed satisfied with the food, which is always a good sign. Elinor felt a glow of accomplishment. She had successfully prepared and served her first meal for 20 hungry ranch hands, and no one had complained about the quality or quantity. It was a small victory, but an important one. The afternoon was spent preparing for supper and doing other household chores. Alina helped with the laundry, cleaned several rooms in the house, and began learning the routine for evening meal preparation. Mrs. Henderson continued to supervise and instruct, but Alina could see that the older woman was already beginning to trust her with more independent tasks. As evening approached, Alina realized that she had been too busy to think about her previous worries and uncertainties. The demanding work and new environment had absorbed all her attention, leaving no time for self-pity or regret. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt useful and productive, contributing to something larger than herself. When the day finally ended and Alina climbed the stairs to her small room, she was exhausted but satisfied. She had survived her first day at the Double Bar Ranch, and she was confident that she could handle whatever challenges the work might bring. As she prepared for bed, she looked out her window at the star-filled sky and felt grateful for the unexpected turn her life had taken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons, but tonight Alina Whitmore fell asleep feeling hopeful about her future for the first time in months. 3 weeks into her employment at the Double Bar Ranch, Alina had settled into a rhythm that felt both challenging and rewarding. Her days began before sunrise with the preparation of breakfast for the ranch hands, continued through the demanding work of keeping house for a large operation, and ended with supper cleanup after dark. The work was harder than anything she had done before, but she found satisfaction in the tangible results of her efforts and the respect she was earning from the people around her. Mrs. Henderson had proven to be an excellent employer, demanding high standards but providing clear guidance and fair treatment. The older woman had gradually given Alina more responsibility, trusting her to manage meal preparation with minimal supervision and to handle various household tasks independently. Alina took pride in meeting these expectations and was particularly pleased when Mrs. Henderson complimented her bread-making skills. "You have a light hand with the dough," Mrs. Henderson observed one morning as Alina shaped loaves for the day's baking. "The men have commented favorably on the bread, which is unusual. Most cowboys don't pay much attention to such things unless something is wrong." Alina smiled at the praise. Bread making had been one of her mother's specialties, and she was glad to have inherited the skill. The ranch went through enormous quantities of bread, and Alina had learned to time the baking so that fresh loaves were available for each meal. The ranch hands had also begun to accept Alina as part of the operation. Most were polite and appreciative of her work, and a few had started to engage in friendly conversation during meals. She had learned their names and preferences, remembering who liked extra gravy and who preferred their coffee black. These small details seemed to matter to men who spent long days working in difficult conditions. Luke Cameron had become a regular presence in Alina's daily routine, though their interactions remained carefully proper. He often appeared in the kitchen area on ranch business, checking on repairs or discussing supply needs with Mrs. Henderson. During these visits, he would exchange pleasant conversation with Alina, asking about her work and offering assistance if she needed anything from town. Alina found herself looking forward to these brief encounters more than she probably should. Luke had a way of making her feel valued and respected that went beyond simple politeness. He asked about her opinions on ranch matters, listened to her suggestions about meal planning, and treated her as an intelligent person whose thoughts were worth considering. After years of being dismissed or ignored by most men, this attention was both flattering and confusing. One afternoon, while Alina was hanging laundry on the lines behind the house, Luke approached with a serious expression. He had been out checking the cattle with some of the other hands and still wore his work clothes and hat. "Alina," he said, his voice more formal than usual, "I wanted to speak with you about something." Alina felt a flutter of nervousness. "Of course, what is it?" Luke glanced around to ensure they were alone, then spoke quietly. "There's been some talk in town about you working out here. Nothing serious, but I thought you should know." Alina felt her heart sink. "What kind of talk?" "Some people think it's improper for an unmarried woman to be living and working on a ranch with so many men around. Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell has been particularly vocal about it." Alina sighed. She had hoped that her move to the ranch would end the gossip surrounding her situation, but apparently it had only provided new material for speculation. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. What exactly is she saying? Nothing specific, just implications about your character and suggestions that your arrangement here isn't respectable. Luke's expression showed his disapproval of such talk. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson are above reproach, and everyone knows this ranch is run properly, but some people will always find something to criticize. Eleanor felt a familiar anger rise in her chest. I'm working hard and earning an honest living. I don't see how anyone could find fault with that. They can't really, Luke agreed. It's just small-town gossip from people with too little to occupy their time, but I thought you should be aware in case you hear comments when you're in town. Eleanor appreciated the warning, though it frustrated her to know that her efforts to build a respectable life were still being questioned by some members of the community. Thank you for telling me. I'll be prepared if anyone says anything directly. Luke hesitated, then stepped closer. Eleanor, I want you to know that anyone with sense can see you're a good woman doing honest work. Don't let ignorant gossip make you doubt yourself or your place here. The intensity in his voice and the way he looked at her made Eleanor's pulse quicken. There was something in his eyes that went beyond casual friendship, and she found herself wondering if Luke's interest in her welfare was purely neighborly. I appreciate your support, she said softly. It means a great deal to have someone believe in me. Luke held her gaze for a moment longer, and Eleanor felt the air between them grow charged with unspoken possibilities. Then the sound of voices from the bunkhouse broke the spell, and Luke stepped back, his expression returning to its usual composed friendliness. I should get back to work, he said, but remember what I said, you belong here as much as anyone. Eleanor watched him walk away, her heart beating faster than the simple conversation warranted. She was beginning to realize that her feelings for Luke Cameron were developing beyond gratitude and friendship into something more dangerous and complicated. That evening, as Eleanor served supper to the ranch hands, she noticed several of them glancing at her with what seemed like protective concern. She wondered if Luke had spoken to them about the gossip from town, and whether the men felt any obligation to defend her reputation. The thought was both touching and embarrassing, as she didn't want to be the cause of any conflict between the ranch and the community. After the meal, as Eleanor was cleaning up the kitchen, Mrs. Henderson approached her with a thoughtful expression. Eleanor, I understand there's been some talk in town about your position here. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. Yes, ma'am, Luke mentioned it to me this afternoon. Mrs. Henderson nodded. I thought he might. I want you to know that I don't give a fig for what Dorothy Mitchell or anyone else has to say about how I run my household. You're a good worker and a respectable young woman, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for her employer's support. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I hope my presence here doesn't cause any problems for you and your husband. Nonsense, Mrs. Henderson said briskly. This ranch employs whoever we choose to employ, and we don't ask permission from the town busybodies. You're doing important work here, and don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. The next few days passed without incident, but Eleanor could sense a subtle tension among the ranch hands that suggested they were aware of the situation and prepared to defend her if necessary. She was both grateful for their support and concerned about the potential for conflict. On Saturday afternoon, Eleanor had her first opportunity to visit town since beginning work at the ranch. Mrs. Henderson needed several supplies that couldn't wait for the regular delivery, and she asked Eleanor to make the trip with one of the hands who was going to town on other business. Eleanor dressed carefully for the excursion, wearing her best day dress and making sure her appearance was beyond reproach. She was determined not to give the town gossips any ammunition for their criticisms. The hand who drove her to town was a middle-aged man named Pete who had been working ranches for most of his adult life. He was taciturn by nature, but had always been polite to Eleanor during meals. Miss Eleanor, Pete said as they approached town, if anyone gives you any trouble while we're here, you just let me know. The boys and we think you're a fine lady, and we don't appreciate folks saying otherwise. Eleanor was touched by his simple declaration of support. Thank you, Pete. I hope there won't be any trouble. Probably won't be, Pete replied. Most folks got better sense than to cause problems, but just in case. Their first stop was the general store, where Eleanor needed to purchase several items on Mrs. Henderson's list. The store was busy with Saturday shoppers, and Eleanor could feel curious gazes following her as she moved through the aisles. The storekeeper, Mr. Williams, was polite and helpful, filling her order efficiently without comment on her changed circumstances. As Alina was paying for her purchases, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, if it isn't the mail-order bride who's made herself so comfortable at the double bar. Alina turned to find Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell standing behind her with two other women, all of whom were regarding her with expressions of disapproval and curiosity. Mrs. Mitchell, Alina said calmly, "Good afternoon." "I suppose you think you're quite clever," Mrs. Mitchell continued, her voice loud enough to attract the attention of other customers. "Finding a way to support yourself surrounded by all those men, though I wonder what kind of support you're really providing." Alina felt her temper flare but forced herself to remain composed. "I'm working as a housekeeper and cook, Mrs. Mitchell. It's honest employment." "Is it, though?" one of the other women interjected. "It seems rather convenient that you found such a comfortable situation so quickly after James Mitchell showed good sense and changed his mind about marrying you." Alina realized that these women were deliberately trying to provoke her into a public confrontation that would damage her reputation further. She took a deep breath and spoke clearly but quietly. "I work hard for my wages, ladies. I'm up before dawn cooking for 20 men, I do laundry and cleaning all day, and I don't finish my duties until after dark. If you consider that comfortable, you're welcome to apply for similar work yourselves." The straightforward response seemed to catch the women off guard, and before they could formulate a reply, Pete appeared at Alina's side. He was not a large man, but there was something in his weathered face and steady gaze that commanded respect. "Ladies," Pete said politely, touching his hat brim. "Miss Alina, if you're ready, we should be getting back to the ranch. Mrs. Henderson is expecting these supplies." Alina nodded and gathered her packages, grateful for Pete's intervention. As they left the store, she could hear the women resuming their conversation in hushed but animated tones. "Thank you," Alina said to Pete as they loaded her purchases into the wagon. "I appreciate you stepping in." "No thanks needed," Pete replied. "Some folks just got too much time and too little sense." Their next stop was Mrs. Harper's dress shop, where Alina wanted to check on any alteration work that might be available. Mrs. Harper welcomed her warmly and had several items that needed attention. "I'm glad you stopped by," the older woman said. "I've had more requests for alterations since word got around about your fine work. If you have time on your days off, I can keep you busy." Alina was pleased to hear about the additional work opportunities. The extra income would help her save money faster and give her more options for her future. As they prepared to leave town, Alina noticed Luke's horse tied in front of the saloon. She found herself hopping to catch a glimpse of him, then chided herself for such foolish thoughts. Luke was simply a fellow employee at the ranch, and she had no business developing romantic feelings about him. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, with Pete seemingly lost in his own thoughts. As they approached the main house, Alina could see Mrs. Henderson waiting on the porch, and she hurried to unload the supplies and report on her errands. "Any problems in town?" Mrs. Henderson asked as Alina handed over the receipt for the purchases. Alina hesitated, then decided to be honest about the encounter with Mrs. Mitchell. Mrs. Henderson listened to the account with a stern expression. "Dorothy Mitchell needs to find herself a useful occupation," Mrs. Henderson said when Alina finished. "I have a good mind to speak to her husband about her behavior." "Please don't," Alina said quickly. "I don't want to cause any more trouble than there already is." Mrs. Henderson studied Alina's face for a moment. "You handled yourself well, by Pete's account, but don't let people like that make you feel ashamed of honest work. You're contributing something valuable here, and that's more than can be said for women who spend their time spreading malicious gossip." That evening, as the ranch hands gathered for supper, Alina noticed that several of them seemed to be making a point of complimenting her cooking more than usual. She suspected that Pete had told them about the incident in town, and they were showing their support in the way they knew best. Luke appeared for supper with the second group of hands, and Alina thought she detected a concerned look in his eyes when he greeted her. She wondered if he had heard about the confrontation with Mrs. Mitchell, and hoped he wouldn't feel obligated to defend her reputation in some misguided attempt at chivalry. After the meal, as Alina was washing dishes in the kitchen, Luke appeared in the doorway. He looked around to make sure they were alone, then approached her with a serious expression. Pete told me what happened in town today, he said without preamble. Eleanor sighed. I hoped it wouldn't become a topic of general discussion. It won't, Luke assured her. Pete only told a few of us who asked about your trip to town. He said you handled yourself with dignity, which is more than can be said for the other parties involved. Eleanor continued washing dishes, unsure how to respond. She was beginning to realize that Luke's continued interest in her welfare was becoming a source of both comfort and confusion. Eleanor, Luke said quietly, I want you to know that if anyone gives you real trouble, not just petty gossip but actual problems, you can count on support from everyone at this ranch. Eleanor turned to face him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. That's very kind, but I don't want the ranch to have conflict with the community because of me. The Double Bar has been part of this community for 15 years, Luke replied. We contribute to the local economy, we help our neighbors when they need it, and we mind our own business. If some people choose to create problems where none exist, that's their choice, but it won't change how we operate or who we choose to employ. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at the obvious support and protection being offered. I'm grateful to work for people with such principles. Luke stepped closer, and Eleanor could see something in his eyes that made her heart race. It's not just about principles, Eleanor. The people here care about you as a person, not just as an employee. The way he said the words, with particular emphasis on people here, made Eleanor wonder if he was speaking for himself as much as for the ranch community. She found herself caught in his gaze, aware of the growing attraction between them but uncertain about how to respond. Before either of them could say anything more, the sound of Mrs. Henderson's footsteps in the hallway broke the spell. Luke stepped back and assumed a casual posture just as the older woman entered the kitchen. Luke, I wanted to speak with you about the supply order for next week, Mrs. Henderson said, seemingly unaware of any tension in the room. Of course, Luke replied, his voice perfectly normal. Eleanor, thank you for the excellent supper as always. Eleanor nodded and returned to her dishes, her hands slightly unsteady as she processed what had just occurred. The attraction between her and Luke was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and she was beginning to wonder if her feelings might be reciprocated. As she finished her evening chores, Eleanor thought about her situation at the ranch and in the community. Despite the gossip and criticism from some quarters, she was building a life that felt meaningful and sustainable. The work was hard but satisfying, her employers treated her with respect and fairness, and she was earning enough money to secure her independence. More complicated was the growing attachment she felt to Luke Cameron. She was beginning to care about him in ways that went far beyond gratitude for his help, and she suspected that he might have similar feelings. But Eleanor was also aware that her position at the ranch was still relatively new and potentially fragile, and she didn't want to complicate matters by pursuing a romantic relationship with a fellow employee. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed in her small room, she stood by the window looking out at the ranch yard. The bunkhouse windows glowed with lamplight, and she could hear the distant sound of the men talking and laughing after their day's work. It was a peaceful scene, and Eleanor felt a deep sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was determined to prove herself worthy of the trust and support she was receiving. And if her relationship with Luke developed into something more than friendship, she would face that possibility with the same determination and honesty that had brought her this far. For now, Eleanor Whitmore was exactly where she needed to be, building a new life one day at a time in the vast and promising landscape of the American West 3. The arrival of spring brought new energy to the Double Bar Ranch, and with it came the busy season that would test everything Eleanor had learned during her first months of employment. Roundup time meant additional hands, longer days, and the kind of demanding work that separated capable workers from those who couldn't handle the pressure. Eleanor was determined to prove herself during this crucial period, knowing that her success would establish her permanent place at the ranch. Mrs. Henderson had begun preparing for Roundup weeks in advance, ordering extra supplies, planning menus that could be prepared efficiently in large quantities, and organizing the household to accommodate the increased workload. Eleanor had been included in all these discussions, and her suggestions about meal planning and work distribution had been received with respect and consideration. Roundup season will show what you're really made of, Mrs. Henderson told Eleanor one morning as they reviewed the plans for feeding 30 men 3 times a day for 6 weeks. It's exhausting work, but there's satisfaction in knowing you're contributing to the success of the entire operation. Elena felt both excitement and nervousness about the challenge ahead. She had proven herself capable of managing the regular household routine, but Roundup would require stamina, organization, and the ability to work under pressure that she had never been tested on before. The first of the additional hands began arriving on a Monday morning in early April. Elena watched from the kitchen window as cowboys rode into the ranch yard, leading pack horses and driving small remudas of horses that would be needed for the roundup work. Most were men who had worked previous roundups at the double bar, but there were also some new faces among the group. Luke had been promoted to roundup foreman for this season, a position that reflected Mr. Henderson's confidence in his abilities and judgment. Elena had noticed Luke taking on additional responsibilities throughout the winter, and she was proud of his advancement even as she realized it would mean less opportunity for casual conversation during the busy weeks ahead. The first test of Elena's capabilities came that very evening when she had to prepare supper for 28 men instead of the usual 20. The increase seemed small in numbers, but Elena quickly learned that it required careful adjustment of quantities and timing to ensure that everyone was fed properly. Elena had spent the afternoon preparing vegetables and calculating portions, but she still felt anxious as the supper bell rang and the men began filing into the dining room. She served the meal efficiently, moving quickly between the kitchen and dining room to keep serving dishes filled and coffee cups refilled. To her relief, the meal went smoothly. The men were appreciative of the food, and there was enough of everything without excessive waste. Elena began to feel more confident about her ability to handle the increased demands of roundup season. After the meal, as Elena was cleaning up the kitchen, Luke appeared in the doorway. He looked tired from his day of organizing men and equipment, but he smiled when he saw her. "Excellent supper, Elena." The new hands were impressed with both the quality and quantity of the food. Elena felt a warm glow of satisfaction at his praise. "Thank you. It was a bit hectic, but I think I'm getting the hang of cooking for larger numbers." Luke moved closer, lowering his voice. "How are you feeling about the weeks ahead? It's going to be demanding work." Elena appreciated his concern. "I'm nervous but excited. Mrs. Henderson has prepared me well, and I want to prove I can handle whatever the roundup brings." "I'm sure you can," Luke said, and the confidence in his voice meant more to Elena than he probably realized. "If you need anything, or if any of the men give you trouble, let me know immediately." Elena nodded, though she hoped such intervention wouldn't be necessary. She wanted to succeed on her own merits, not because the foreman was protecting her. As Luke prepared to leave, he hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Elena, I want you to know that watching you succeed here has been one of the best parts of this winter for me." Before Elena could respond, Luke touched his hat brim and left the kitchen, leaving her with a racing heart and a mind full of questions about what his words might mean. The next few days established the rhythm of roundup season. Elena rose even earlier than usual to begin breakfast preparation, worked steadily throughout the day preparing meals and maintaining the household, and fell into bed exhausted each night. The work was physically demanding, but Elena found satisfaction in the smooth operation of her kitchen and the appreciation of the men who depended on her cooking. Mrs. Henderson worked alongside Elena, handling some of the regular household chores while Elena focused on the increased cooking demands. The older woman's support and guidance were invaluable, and Elena gained new respect for Mrs. Henderson's ability to manage such a complex operation. Among the new hands was a man named Jake Morrison, who immediately stood out from the others. He was loud, crude, and seemed to take particular pleasure in making comments about Elena whenever she was within earshot. His remarks were not overtly offensive, but they carried implications that made Elena uncomfortable. "That's some fine cooking, miss," Morrison said one evening after supper, his tone suggesting he was referring to more than just her culinary skills. "A man could get used to being taken care of so well." Elena ignored the comment, but she noticed several of the regular hands exchanging glances with obvious disapproval. She hoped the situation wouldn't escalate into anything more serious. The problem came to a head the following Saturday evening when Morrison had been drinking in town and returned to the ranch in an aggressive mood. Elena was in the kitchen finishing the supper cleanup when she heard heavy footsteps on the back porch. Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, swaying slightly and looking at Alina with an expression that made her immediately uncomfortable. "Well, if it isn't our pretty little cook," he said, his voice slurred but his intent clear. "Mr. Morrison," Alina said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Supper is over and the kitchen is closed. If you need something, you can speak with Mrs. Henderson." Morrison stepped into the kitchen, ignoring her words. "What I need is some private conversation with you, sweetheart. I've been watching you, and I think we could come to an understanding." Alina moved toward the door, but Morrison stepped sideways to block her path. "I don't know what you mean, but I need to finish my work. Please excuse me." "Don't play innocent with me," Morrison said, moving closer. "A woman in your position, living out here with all these men, she's got to be looking for some companionship. I'm willing to provide that companionship." Alina felt fear rising in her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You're mistaken, Mr. Morrison. I'm not interested in any kind of companionship beyond professional courtesy." Morrison laughed unpleasantly. "Professional courtesy, is that what you call it? Come on, honey, we both know what kind of woman answers a mail-order bride advertisement and then ends up cooking for cowboys." Alina's temper flared at the insult. "What kind of woman? A woman trying to make an honest living, which is more than I can say for a man who drinks too much and bothers women who are trying to work." Morrison's expression turned ugly. "Don't get uppity with me, girl. I know your type and I know what you really want." He reached out to grab Alina's arm, but before his hand could make contact, a voice from the doorway stopped him cold. "Take your hand away and step back, Morrison." Alina looked toward the door to see Luke standing there, his expression deadly serious and his body positioned for action. Morrison turned to face Luke with belligerent confusion. "This is private business, Cameron. Why don't you move along?" "This is ranch business," Luke replied, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. "Miss Whitmore is under the protection of this ranch, and you will treat her with respect or find yourself unemployed." Morrison seemed to realize for the first time that he had crossed a serious line. "I wasn't doing nothing wrong, just talking to the lady." "The lady asked you to leave and you refused," Luke said, moving into the kitchen with purposeful strides. "That's not talking, that's harassment. You have two choices, Morrison. You can apologize to Miss Whitmore and give me your word that nothing like this will happen again, or you can collect your pay and be off this ranch before sunrise." Alina watched the confrontation with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. She was glad for Luke's intervention, but she worried about the implications for ranch morale if a hand was fired because of her. Morrison looked between Luke and Alina, apparently calculating his options. "I didn't mean no harm," he mumbled, "was just trying to be friendly." "Apologize," Luke said firmly. Morrison turned reluctantly to Alina. "Sorry, miss, didn't mean to bother you." Alina nodded stiffly. "Apology accepted." Luke stepped aside to let Morrison pass, but his voice followed the man to the door. "Remember what I said, Morrison. There won't be a second warning." After Morrison left, Luke turned to Alina with concern. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Alina shook her head, though she was still shaking slightly from the encounter. "No, he didn't touch me. Thank you for intervening when you did." Luke's expression remained serious. "I should have dealt with him sooner. I knew he was making comments, but I thought warnings from the other hands would be enough to keep him in line." Alina appreciated Luke's concern, but she was also aware of the potential complications. "I hope this doesn't cause problems with the other men. I don't want anyone to think I can't handle myself or that I need special protection." Luke moved closer, his eyes intense. "Alina, you can handle yourself better than most people I know, but that doesn't mean you should have to tolerate harassment from men like Morrison. Every person on this ranch deserves to work in safety and with dignity." Alina felt her heart race at Luke's proximity and the intensity of his concern for her welfare. "I appreciate that truly, but I worry about the implications for my position here." Luke reached out and gently touched her arm. "Your position here is secure, Alina. You've proven yourself a dozen times over, and everyone on this ranch respects the work you do. Don't let one ignorant cowboy make you doubt your worth." Alina looked into Luke's eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. The concern and protectiveness in his expression went beyond professional courtesy or even friendship. She realized that Luke cared about her as more than a fellow employee, and the knowledge sent a thrill through her even as it complicated her already confusing feelings. "Luke," she said softly, then stopped, unsure how to express what she was thinking and feeling. Luke seemed to understand her hesitation. "I know this isn't the time or place for personal conversations, but Alina, I want you to know that you mean more to me than just someone I work with. You're important to me, and your safety and happiness matter to me in ways that go beyond my duties as foreman." Alina felt her cheeks warm at his words. "You're important to me too, Luke, more than I probably should admit." Luke smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the confrontation with Morrison. "I'm glad to hear that. When Roundup is over and things settle down, I hope we can talk more about what that might mean for both of us." Alina nodded, her heart pounding with possibilities. "I'd like that." Luke stepped back reluctantly. "For now, though, I should let you finish your work. Will you be all right here alone?" "I'll be fine," Alina assured him. "Morrison won't bother me again." "No, he won't," Luke agreed with certainty. "But if anyone gives you any trouble at all, you find me immediately." After Luke left, Alina finished her kitchen duties with her mind racing. The confrontation with Morrison had been unpleased.